Good morning and welcome to another episode of The Global Current. I'm Joshua Siegel.
And I'm Karina Taylor.
In news, the upcoming Chinese-Japanese-Korean summit.
The Taliban makes gains in Afghanistan, and American and Iraqi forces launch joint strikes against ISIS.
In analysis, recent violence in the West Bank and the racial implications of South African tuition increases.
Then The Global Current brings you an interview with Alyson Neel of the UN Foundation on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
And now, John Chido reports on the upcoming multilateral summit between Japan, China, and Korea.
The Japan Times reports that Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and South Korean President Park Geun-hye have agreed to convene at a summit meeting along with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang to be held in late October or early November this year. According to the article, President Obama asked President Park to push for improved Japan-South Korea relations to build solidarity between the key U.S. allies in Asia. The summit will focus on resolving animosity between the two nations over the history of Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula and the use of South Korean comfort women during World War II. However, the summit takes place amidst an ongoing dispute between Japan and South Korea over islets in the Sea of Japan.
We are currently focused on making the trilateral summit a success. As for a bilateral summit between Korea and Japan, we will hold working-level talks at the Director General level as the next step.
The South China Morning Post reports that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe avoided visiting Yasukuni Shrine, where Japan's war dead are buried, yet sent a ritual offering instead. Prime Minister Abe's visits to the shrine have been a source of contention with South Korea in years past. The article claims that Prime Minister Abe intends to circumvent the issue by not visiting the shrine while still placating his conservative base by sending an offering. A New York Times article reiterates that the meeting between the two East Asian leaders is the culmination of months of negotiation. The article cites China's recent assertive policies and the North Korean nuclear arms programs as causes for the United States' interest in improving relations between Japan and South Korea. This is John Chido for The Global Current.
Next, Connor Breza explores recent gains made by the Taliban in Afghanistan.
The New York Times reiterated United Nations data that the Taliban in Afghanistan have regained the influence they had before the U.S. invasion in 2001. The article takes into account the Taliban's capture of the city of Kunduz on the 28th of last month. Afghanistan has been under U.S. occupation since 2001, but the Taliban continue to threaten stability as U.S. forces have withdrawn. The Taliban's influence over Kunduz demonstrates the inability of U.S.-backed Afghan security forces to maintain stability. The UN report classifies 27 out of the 34 Afghani provinces as having districts with either high or extreme Taliban threat levels. The Taliban threat is concentrated around the country's main highway. In a 2012 interview with the heads of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, Senator Dianne Feinstein and Representative Mike Rogers, the pair disclosed to CNN that they felt that the Taliban was certainly stronger even at that point. After 3 years, the situation has only worsened. Last week, President Barack Obama reiterated widespread concerns about the Afghan security force.
Afghan forces are still not as strong as they need to be. They are developing critical capabilities: intelligence, logistics, aviation, command, and control. And meanwhile, the Taliban has made gains, particularly in rural areas, and can still launch deadly attacks in cities, including Kabul. The bottom line is, in key areas of the country, the security situation is still very fragile, and in some places, there's risk of deterioration.
The president announced that the U.S. will leave roughly 10,000 U.S. personnel in the country to deter further Taliban encroachment. Reporting for The Global Current, this is Connor Breza.
Yilin Du examines the joint strike against ISIS by American and Iraqi forces.
In Baghdad, the Iraqi and American governments work together to battle Islamic State militants, with ISIS recently taking over Ramadi and the U.S. force lacking on good performance in the eviction of ISIS. A New York Times interview with Lieutenant General Sean B. McFarland, the American commander in Iraq and Syria, reiterates that U.S. and Iraqi forces aim to thwart ISIS on multiple fronts. We're doing what you always try to do to the enemy, and that is force him to fight in more than one direction at the same time. While American military strategy has succeeded in battle, the Iraqi government still faces internal problems. First, the Islamic State uses the Euphrates River to secretly transport militants into the city of Ramadi. Second, Iraqi police lack the training necessary to fight ISIS fighters. The U.S. government has also maintained that military aid will be withdrawn should the Iraqi government seek Russian aid. In an interview by CBS with Marine General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it would make it very difficult for us to be able to provide the kind of support you need if the Russians were here conducting operations as well. We can't conduct operations if the Russians were operating in Iraq right now. This is Elaine Du for the Global Current.
Up next, Michael Iannalfo reports on the surge of violence in Israel and the West Bank.
The current clashes between Israelis and Palestinians began after an Israeli man was stabbed by a Palestinian man. This was in response to the perceived fear that the Israeli government is trying to change the status quo agreement that exists in the region. CNN reports that this agreement is an unwritten understanding that does not allow Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located. This is a holy site to both Jews and Muslims alike. The Times of Israel explains that, for Jews, it is the site of ancient temples. They believe that God's presence still resides in the area. For Muslims, it is the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. While the Times of Israel reports that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said the status quo will not change, there are Jewish activists and even some politicians who want the status quo to change and want Jews to have the right to pray on the Temple Mount. Some people even want to rebuild the old Jewish temple on the site of the mosque. One Jewish activist, Elishama Sandman, who gives tours at the Temple Mount, told the Times of Israel, "As more and more Jews are going up, it is clear that this is bringing us closer to the immediate goal of prayer rights and afterwards the temple." This type of rhetoric has caused Palestinians to distrust the Israeli government when it says it does not want to change the status quo. At a protest in Jerusalem, a Palestinian man explained to a CNN reporter that,
"Because the Aqsa Mosque we need for us, the Aqsa is for us, so we will never forgive up."
This sentiment is common among Palestinians who feel that Israelis are occupying their land. They fear the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be taken away from them. Both sides have done their part in exacerbating the situation. U.S. News reports that Benjamin Netanyahu said about Abbas, "He incites all the time. He and his Fatah partners and their official websites of the PA incite day in, day out on social networks." The media monitoring reports that, for his part, Mahmoud Abbas said, "The Al-Aqsa Mosque is ours, and they have no right to defile it with their filthy feet. We will not allow them to, and we will do everything in our power to protect Jerusalem." While these statements would seem to indicate that the situation is getting worse and that there is no hope for a peaceful solution, there is still a chance for peace to prevail. This audio clip from the Huffington Post may sound like a protest, but is actually a peace rally. It consists of both Jews and Palestinians condemning violence and racism. Despite the current situation, it is possible to return to peace and calm. In order for this to happen, both sides need to stop inciting violence. The Palestinian leadership needs to stop insulting Jews as a whole, and the Israeli government should take down the wall they put up around East Jerusalem, as well as ease security measures. Currently, Israel has restricted worship at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al Jazeera reports that no man below the age of 45 is allowed to enter or pray at the mosque, while women have no restrictions. Rules like this create resentment among the Palestinian population, which would cause further resentments and distrust of the Israeli government. Also, The Independent reports that, in an interview with Israeli Army Radio, the mayor of Jerusalem, Nir Barkat, said, "Given the current escalation of violence in the security situation, those with a licensed firearm who know what to do with it must go out with their weapons. It's an imperative." This promises only to make the situation worse if Palestinians feel like Israelis are taking the law into their own hands. This issue will not resolve itself unless both sides take responsibility and do their best to discourage violence. It is clear that continuous fighting will not resolve any issues that the Palestinians and Israelis have. The international community can help with this, and NPR reports that the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon visited Jerusalem on Wednesday and spoke with Benjamin Netanyahu and the King of Jordan. The Secretary General said, "Israelis and Palestinians are standing on the brink of another catastrophic period of violence. We need to keep the situation from escalating into a religious conflict. The United Nations should help restart negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians by using its prestige as an impartial international organization." The demonstration of a mass peace rally by both sides shows that people want peace. Peace can be brought about with constructive dialogue facilitated by the United Nations. However, dialogue can only start when violence stops.
Megan Ferguson takes a look at the racial implications of South African university tuition increases.
The social media campaign #FeesMustFall abruptly overcame South African Twitter and Facebook beginning on Monday, October 19th. Along with #National Shutdown, the hashtags hope to alert social media users in other countries to the struggles of South African students and to unite the students in opposition to tuition increases at South African universities many believe would force Black students to drop out or risk incurring lifelong debt. Deutsche Welle on October 19, 2015 explains, "The national funding for South African universities has not kept pace with enrollment, which has doubled in the past 10 years. The National Student Financial Aid Scheme fell short by over $3.7 billion, and rising inflation and utilities costs threatened to push colleges into debt. In order to keep up with rising costs, universities proposed a tuition increase between 10 and 15%, pushing the price of attendance to $8,000 per year. Half of that must be paid up front." For context, Pew Research of December 6, 2013, the latest available poll consolidating South African salary information by race, points out Black South Africans, who comprise 80% of the population, make an average of $10,000 per year, while the tuition increase is significantly more affordable for white South Africans, who make 8 times that amount on average. Thousands of students flocked to the South African parliament to protest the tuition hike.
We have a situation here with bottles and stun grenades and just gone off. There are missiles more stun grenades going off.
Blade Ndzami, South Africa's Minister of Higher Education, reduced the tuition hike to only 6%, but not before clashes between students and riot police resulted in the arrest of 23 protesters. South African students remain protesting the reduced tuition rate, demanding a 0% increase. And when considering South Africa's economic inequality is so closely tied to race, it's not difficult to see why. Federally subsidized higher education was originally a means of escape for young Black South Africans. One Rhodes University scholar stated in an anonymous open letter to Minister Nzimande, published in All Africa on October 20th, after the end of apartheid in the late 1990s, Black families have comprised a new South African middle class. However, as debt and a struggle to find high-paying employment cripple Black South Africans, South Africa's proud, straight-A child and their family struggle to maintain the comforts of suburbia. The Atlanta Black Star of October 19th continues. A college degree is increasingly essential component of suburban, middle-class life in South Africa. Employers demand degrees for jobs which did not originally require them. And as young South Africans enter the workforce, a college degree has become necessary not only for social mobility, but to remain able to live paycheck to paycheck in the first place. As a result, Black students in South Africa may not be able to afford pursuing higher education, leaving employment and social mobility to white students, and exacerbating economic inequality amongst racial lines. The increase in tuition could not only increase broad economic inequality between races in South Africa, but also prolong racial tension, as a lack of diversity in classrooms could reduce discussion of important racial issues. The previously cited Atlanta Black Star points out, only 53% of white students believe apartheid was a crime against humanity. However, when Black students first began sharing classrooms with white students a decade ago, 70% of white students responded apartheid was a crime against humanity. Equally, as Black enrollment in South African universities decreases, 73% of Black South Africans, and 44% of whites claim neither race will ever be able to trust the other. Without Black student enrollment in higher education, this number is only likely to increase, preventing Black employment not only because of a lack of access to higher education, but a strengthening of prevailing stereotypes. With a majority of protesters fighting for a 0% increase in tuition, #FeesMustFall reveals an important junction for South African race relations. A tuition hike could set back the strides toward racial and economic equality undertaken since apartheid by years. Reporting for the Global Current.
Finally, the Global Current brings you an interview with Alyson Neel of the UN Foundation to discuss the Sustainable Development Goals.
Good morning, Global Current listeners. This is Emily Livaday with the Global Current, and I'm sitting here with Alyson Neel from the UN Foundation. She's going to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you for being here, first of all.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so a prelude to the Sustainable Development Goals would be the Millennial Development Goals. So could you talk a little bit about those, what we learned from the Millennial Development Goals?
Sure, of course. So the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs as they were called, were adopted in 2000. And that's been sort of the to-do list of the world for the last 15 years. And it included, the crux of the agenda was eradicating poverty. And along with a number of other things like gender equality, and global health, improving maternal health and issues like this. And looking back, now it's 2015, and when we look back on how we did pretty well. You look at the stats and you know that the MDGs inspired policies and investments that helped lift 600 million people out of extreme poverty, prevented 4.3 million deaths from malaria, and just improved the lives of millions around the world. And so we did fairly well. At the same time, we have a lot of work to do and many challenges persist. And that is what leads us to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes. And how are the Sustainable Development Goals different from the Millennial Development?
So, great question. There are a lot of differences. The most obvious one is that there are 17 SDGs, as they are called, or Global Goals for short, and as opposed to the 8 MDGs. And so they're definitely broader in scale, and at the same time you had 18 targets with the MDGs, and with the SDGs, or Global Goals, we now have 169. So the idea of a target is that there are ways in which to measure progress on these larger goals. And there are a bunch of reasons that's the main difference that most people will see. And the reason that is one, it's a more ambitious agenda. And things have changed since 2000. The world has changed geopolitically. Things have changed. So you see the emergence of new kids on the block, where you've got emerging economies. You see a reduction in sort of the this less of a focus on north-south relationships, or that division is sort of being reduced. You also see that the way that we think about development and the way that we think about development aid has changed. So you see, the MDGs were very focused on aid. And while aid remains a very important, critical piece of the equation of reaching these 17 global goals, it's not the entire picture. This is what some have called the beyond aid agenda. And so it's bringing in the private sector. It's bringing in a huge focus on domestic resource mobilization, or basically just taxes, domestic taxes, and things of that sort. So it's really different in that way. And at the same time, the agenda, it's still poverty focused. But what it does that the MDGs don't do is address a lot of these structural issues of the crises around that grip us. And so, you look at, my focus is gender policy, for example, and you look at how we went from having one goal and one target, and that was education focused in the MDGs, to a standalone goal on gender equality in the SDGs, plus, 9 targets. So, and what's great about that is that it's, yes, that's a lot of targets, but you can't just measure the level of gender equality by education. And so there are a lot of things you have to look at, like political voice and representation, violence against women, discrimination in the workforce, access to education. And so the agenda, the post-2015 agenda, the global goals, the sustainable development goals, whatever you want to call it, is far more ambitious than the previous agenda.
I was going to ask, the SDGs seem to be very bold. They're saying that they want to end poverty and they want to end world hunger. Is this too ambitious, or is this just a way to set norms?
So that's a great question. It's very ambitious. I don't think it's too ambitious. And when you look at what development experts and analysts are looking at it now and are thinking about and are trying to quantify or trying to put some sort of number to whether or not it's too ambitious. And most have said it's very ambitious. We can do it. We just can't. What we have, if we maintain business as usual, if we just keep doing things the way that we're doing them, we definitely won't achieve the goals. So we have to change everything and the way we think about everything and we do everything. The good news is that we see signs of that. I mean, this was the most inclusive process, the most transparent process in the UN's history. You saw civil society, you saw the private sector, you saw, so many consultations with all of these actors, and then you had 193 governments sign on to this agenda. So it's very ambitious, but it reflects needs and what civil society has said, agrees we need, sort of, all the to-do list of what the world needs to get done, and governments have signed on to it.
That's amazing. What were some sustainable development goals that didn't quite make the cut, that were left out, and why?
Goals that didn't make the cut. That's a good question. I'm not trying to think of goals that didn't make the cut. There were certainly targets that didn't make the cut. This was like a 4-year-long process, and so there were a number of issues that folks put forward that were more contentious, that didn't quite make it into a goal, but certainly like a standalone goal, but ended up either becoming a target or either ended up was sort of like a piece of another larger goal that now exists. But some of the more contentious issues have been and continue to be issues like sexual and reproductive health and rights. I mean, that was fiercely negotiated during the negotiations and the meetings, and also there's a phrase, common but differentiated responsibilities, and that's, or CBDR, and that's the idea that it's the idea of that, well, many developed countries were able to become developed countries, were able to industrialize without thinking about sustainable development, or using sort of like what they call like brown development. And didn't have to think about the environment. We weren't there in terms of the mindset. And so you see still some developing countries pushing for or talking about CBDR and, should there be common but differentiated responsibilities in achieving this agenda and sort of the way that they all approach development. Is it truly universal? And so those are issues that continue to be debated and are larger issues that are being debated in both society and in development.
Yeah. Is there any one goal that is more important than any of the other goals that you feel would set the ball rolling?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I could say there's one goal that's more important than all the other goals, but the question of whether or not there are enablers in the agenda among the goals that help us achieve the other goals is what we're figuring out right now. So what are things that we should be doing right now in the next 12 to 18 months that helps unlock progress in all of these other areas? One goal, of course, that is personal to me is, in my personal background, is gender equality. I'm a former journalist and advocate who focuses on gender policy. And if I focus on gender for a second, what it allows me to show is that the agenda is so integrated. You almost can't say one's more important than the other because, for example, we can't achieve the rest of the agenda if we don't achieve gender equality because it's half of our world's population. And so, but at the same time, if we focus even deeper on gender equality, we can't achieve gender equality if women continue to experience violence, or women who are experiencing violence don't have access to education and economic power and a political voice. And so all of these aspects are all connected. And so it's really hard, and it's something we're figuring out right now, is there a way to is there a way for us to find what those enablers are, and so we can unlock progress across the entire framework?
So what is the UN Foundation doing to ensure the establishment of these goals?
That's a great question too. So as the UN Foundation, our role is to make the UN more effective. We support and we try to make it even better. And the way that we do that, the way that I explain it, is through convening, connecting, and empowering. So our political objective in all of this was to just get a bold and meaningful outcome, to have these goals be as ambitious as they could be. And then, of course, I guess like the goals, our other political goals were to make sure that there was financing for the goals, and to make sure that there was that accountability piece in there too, and to figure out that aspect. And so, so our role has really been about, in this multi-year process of establishing the goals and figuring out how they're financed, is one role is connecting civil society to the political process. So helping them, supporting them in interfacing with the UN, which is not always the easiest place to navigate. It's also about, if a sticky issue arises in the negotiations, we try to support member states, and that'll be through formal or informal gatherings, to try to just put the people in the room that need to figure out that issue so we can move along and get somewhere constructive. And so we often do that. We're often just trying to get all the actors in the same place and the right configuration to move things along. And then the last thing we do is we're just a resource. I mean, we try to be a resource to member states, to especially those that whose missions might have a lower capacity than others. So we try to support them. We try to support civil society, and that's really what we're doing.
And so for funding, is it mostly coming from states, or is it donations or private sector? Like who's funding?
Who's footing the bill? So what's really different about this agenda is that you don't see this focus on aid. And so what that means is that you have a greater focus on states raising it themselves. And, as it's called in development speak, domestic resource mobilization. And so that's, and you also see funding coming and commitments coming from the private sector, not just money, but also commitments to the goals and commitments to integrate it into their policies. So it's really different in that way. It was not the case 15 years ago.
Last question. What will be the biggest challenge the world must overcome to make sure these goals are actually achieved?
The biggest challenge. I think the biggest challenge, something we talked about before, is it's not inevitable that we achieve these goals. And it is a really ambitious agenda.
Yes.
And so it really is going to take everyone to implement it and to achieve it. And it's also going to take not doing business as usual. And so that's hard. To me, that's going to be the hardest thing, is that we really have to do and think and work differently. And that's going to be a huge challenge, but I think we're up for it.
Awesome. Well, that's about all the time we have. Thank you so much for meeting with me. This was Alyson Neel from the UN Foundation, and I'm Emily Livaday for the Global Current. If you would like to learn more about the Sustainable Development Goals, you can log on to sustainabledevelopment.un.org. That's sustainabledevelopment.un.org.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Joshua Siegel. We'll see you next week.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Alicia Sharabali. Our associate producer is Bill Kolba. Our news editor is John Chateau, and our analysis editor is Blythe Brady. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on 89.5 FM WSOU, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.